"I speak 9 languages," said the young black woman. The judge laughed, but was speechless when he heard her. The laughter echoed through the courtroom like cruel thunder. Judge Harrison Foster leaned back in his chair, wiping tears of amusement from his eyes as he watched the 24-year-old standing before him with her hands cuffed. 9 languages? He repeated between laughs. "Miss Williams, this is a court of law, not a television talent show." Kesha Williams stood motionless, her brown eyes fixed on the magistrate who would decide her fate. Accused of forging college diplomas to get work as a translator at multinational companies, she had been arrested at her small home on the outskirts of Atlanta 3 days earlier, in front of shocked neighbors and TV cameras that turned her misfortune into national entertainment. Prosecutor Marcus Thompson, a white man in an impeccable suit and a condescending smile, dramatically leafed through the documents on his desk. "Your Honor, the defendant claims to be fluent in English, Spanish, French, Mandarin, Arabic, German, Russian, Japanese, and Portuguese. She only has a high school education and grew up in a housing project. The fraud is obvious." "It's true that I don't have any college degrees," Kesha said calmly, surprising everyone in the room. Most defendants remain silent during preliminary hearings. "But that doesn't mean I lie about what I can do." Judge Foster raised an eyebrow, his amusement turning to irritation. "Miss Williams, I suggest you stop prolonging this embarrassment. We have evidence that you charged thousands of dollars for services you clearly could not provide." "With all due respect, Your Honor," Kesha replied, her posture straight despite the handcuffs. "You are judging me without hearing me out. If you'll allow me to demonstrate." "Demonstrate?" Foster burst out laughing again. "What are you going to do, recite the Chinese alphabet?" In the front row of the gallery, Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a defense attorney who had offered to represent Kesha pro bono after seeing the case in the news, watched with growing indignation. She had tried to dissuade her client from insisting on this demonstration, but Kesha had remained adamant. She wanted her chance to prove the truth. "Your Honor," Dr. Rodriguez stood up. "My client has the right to defend herself properly. If she claims to have these abilities, why not allow her to demonstrate them?" Foster adjusted his glasses, clearly annoyed. "Because it's ridiculous, Dr. Rodriguez. Look at her. A young black woman, no higher education, raised in the suburbs. How the hell would she speak 9 languages?" The silence that followed was deafening. Journalists in the gallery exchanged shocked glances. Some members of the jury shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The racist comment had been said aloud, recorded, broadcast live. But Kesha showed no surprise. Her eyes narrowed slightly, and for a moment, something dangerous flashed in her gaze. Not anger, but steel-cold determination. It was the expression of someone who had faced this same doubt thousands of times before and developed infinite patience to prove others' ignorance. "Your Honor," she said with a calmness that made the air in the room seem thicker. "You have just proven exactly why I am here. Not because I lied about my abilities, but because I live in a world that refuses to believe that people like me can have extraordinary talents." Foster frowned, realizing he had stepped on dangerous ground, but it was too late. The cameras had captured everything, and something in Kesha's tone suggested that she wasn't just another desperate defendant trying to escape fair charges. It was as if she were guarding a secret too powerful to reveal before the right time, patiently waiting for the system to dig its own grave of prejudice and ignorance. If this story of injustice and determination touched you as much as it touched millions who followed the case, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because what happened next would prove that underestimating people based on appearances is always a devastatingly costly mistake. Judge Foster's racist comment echoed through the room like a bomb. Within seconds, the courtroom turned into a silent battlefield. Journalists typed frantically, lawyers whispered among themselves, and on social media, the clip was already spreading like wildfire. "Your Honor," Dr. Rodriguez stood up again, her voice sharp. "I request that this comment be removed from the record and a public apology be made to my client." Foster adjusted his robe, clearly irritated at being confronted. "Dr. Rodriguez, I merely expressed a statistical reality. How many people of that socioeconomic background actually master 9 languages? Let's be practical." Kesha remained motionless, but something changed in her breathing. Her fists clenched subtly inside the handcuffs, and for a moment, her eyes closed as if she were accessing some distant and powerful memory. Prosecutor Thompson took advantage of the moment of tension to intensify his attack. "Your Honor, We have here 3 multinational companies that hired the defendant's services. Global Tech lost a $2 million contract due to incorrect translations from English to Mandarin. Diplomatic Solutions had legal documents rejected by embassies due to grotesque errors in French and Arabic. He waved a stack of papers dramatically. And most seriously, the International Aid Foundation had its humanitarian proposal rejected by the UN because the Russian translations were so bad they looked like a joke. This is not just fraud, it is sabotage of organizations trying to help people in need. Each accusation was like a public stab in the back. Kesha could feel the judgmental glances from the gallery, the weight of disbelief, the automatic assumption of guilt that always accompanied people like her. But there was something strange about her reaction. She didn't seem surprised, just sad. As if she knew exactly where these allegations were coming from. Miss Williams, Foster leaned forward, his voice taking on a false paternal tone. You have a chance here to admit your mistakes, accept a plea bargain, and perhaps receive a lighter sentence. Stop this charade and be honest. It was then that Kesha opened her eyes and did something that surprised everyone in the room. She smiled. Not a bitter or defeated smile, but a smile that carried knowledge, the kind of smile someone wears when they know something others don't. Your Honor, she said calmly, may I ask a question about these companies that are accusing me? Thompson frowned. What kind of question? I would like to know when exactly Global Tech realized that my translation was incorrect. Was it before or after they found out that I didn't have a college degree? An uncomfortable silence fell. Thompson quickly leafed through his papers. That's irrelevant. And Diplomatic Solutions, Kesha continued, her voice gaining strength. Did they reject my work before or after they found out I grew up in Mechanicsville? Mechanicsville was Atlanta's poorest housing project, known nationally for its crime and social neglect. The mention of the name made several members of the jury shift uncomfortably. Dr. Rodriguez saw where her client was going and stood up. Objection, Your Honor. My client is raising legitimate questions about possible discrimination. Overruled, Foster banged his gavel. The defendant's background does not justify fraud. But Kesha wasn't finished. Your Honor, you mentioned that it's statistically unlikely for someone of my background to speak 9 languages. May I ask how many people of my background you actually know? Foster's face flushed. Miss Williams, you are testing my patience. I'm not testing anything, Kesha replied, her voice taking on a hypnotic quality, as if each word were carefully chosen. I'm just trying to understand whether this court judges competence or appearance. It was at that moment that something extraordinary happened. In the gallery, an elderly woman with gray hair stood up quietly. It was Mrs. Chun, a retired teacher who had been following the case in the news. Her eyes were fixed on Kesha with a look of growing recognition. The conversation in the courtroom continued, but Mrs. Chun whispered to the person next to her, I know that girl. Kesha, as if sensing the gaze, turned briefly toward the gallery. When her eyes met Mrs. Chen's, something passed between them, a connection, a shared memory, a secret that was about to change everything. Mrs. Chun took out her cell phone and began typing an urgent message. Meanwhile, Prosecutor Thompson resumed his attack. Your Honor, regardless of the interesting sociological issues the defendant is raising, we have concrete evidence of incompetence. She has caused real damage to legitimate businesses. And how, Kesha interrupted softly, do you know that my translations were incorrect? Do you speak Mandarin? Arabic? Russian? Thompson hesitated. We have experts who have verified. Experts, Kesha repeated, and again that mysterious smile appeared. Interesting. Because I'd love to meet those experts. Especially the ones who checked my work on specific Beijing dialects, or Moroccan versus Egyptian Arabic, or academic versus commercial Russian. The level of specificity made several linguists in the gallery lean forward. This wasn't the language of someone faking knowledge. These were distinctions that only true polyglots would make. Mrs. Chun had finished typing and hit send on a message that read, I found Kesha Williams. It's her. Get everything ready. Now. Foster, realizing he was losing control of the situation, decided to end the charade. Enough. This ridiculous show is over before it even began. I'll schedule the trial for. One moment, Your Honor, a new voice cut through the air. Everyone turned to see an elegant middle-aged man entering the courtroom. His suit was impeccable, his posture commanded respect, and in his hand he carried a leather briefcase that seemed to contain important secrets. Dr. James Morrison, retired ambassador to the United Nations, he introduced himself, walking to the front of the room. I apologize for the interruption, but I believe I have information relevant to this case. Foster frowned. Dr. Morrison, this is a court in session. You can't just. Your Honor, Morrison interrupted politely, I have worked with translators and interpreters for 30 years on diplomatic missions around the world. And I can attest, under oath, that I am personally familiar with the work of Kesha Williams. The silence that followed was absolute. Kesha looked at Morrison with an expression that was a mixture of surprise and something that could have been relief, as if a crucial piece of a complex puzzle had just fallen into place. Thompson jumped out of his chair. Objection. This man was not previously registered as a witness. But Morrison had already opened his briefcase. I have here documents from the United Nations, stamped and signed, proving that Miss Williams has worked as a freelance translator for 3 international humanitarian missions over the past 2 years. Her services were not only satisfactory, but exceptional. Foster seemed to have swallowed his tongue. Thompson frantically leafed through his papers, as if looking for a way to disqualify evidence he clearly hadn't expected. And Kesha? She simply closed her eyes again, as if accessing an inner strength she had saved for this very moment. When she opened them, there was a determination in them that made even Foster recoil slightly in his chair. Your Honor, she said in a voice that now carried authority, I accept your offer of a demonstration. But not here, not like this, not as a spectacle for your amusement. She paused, her eyes scanning every face in the room, the arrogant judge, the desperate prosecutor, her hopeful lawyer, and finally the gallery filled with people who had come to witness her humiliation. If this court truly seeks justice, then allow me to demonstrate not only that I speak 9 languages, but why 3 powerful companies would be willing to lie to destroy a young black woman from the outskirts who dares to compete in their world. What no one in the room knew was that over the past 3 days, while she was in jail, Kesha had not just cried over her unfair fate. She had made calls, activated contacts, and set in motion a plan that had been years in the making, a plan that would turn her apparent destruction into the most devastating exposure of institutional bias the American judicial system had ever witnessed. Each new humiliation only fueled a determination that her oppressors couldn't see, a silent strength fueled by the very injustice they sought to impose, because what those privileged people didn't know was that every act of contempt was writing their own sentence of defeat. The session was suspended for 2 hours so that Dr. Morrison could formally present his evidence. During the break, Kesha was escorted to a private room where she found not only her lawyer, but 3 people she did not expect to see. Mrs. Chun, the retired gallery teacher, was sitting next to a young Asian man in his 30s who was typing furiously on a laptop. At the other end of the table, an elegant middle-aged black woman was organizing documents with military precision. Kesha, Mrs. Chun stood up, her eyes shining with tears of pride. You've grown so much. Do you still remember the Mandarin classes at the community library? The memory hit Kesha like a bolt of lightning. At age 14, she had found Mrs. Chun giving free language lessons to children in the community every Friday. For 3 years, she had attended religiously, absorbing not only Mandarin but also French and German with a thirst for knowledge that impressed even seasoned educators. Teacher Chun, Kesha whispered, her composure finally cracking. I thought you had moved away. I did. To China. I worked as an educational consultant for 5 years. Mrs. Chun smiled. And do you know who I recommended as a freelance translator to several international organizations when I found out they needed someone with multiple language skills? The young man at the laptop looked up. I'm Daniel Park, digital security expert. Professor Chun hired me to investigate the companies that accused you. And what we found, he swiveled the laptop screen to show a complex spreadsheet, will blow this case wide open. The elegant woman introduced herself as Dr. Victoria Johnson, a corporate litigation specialist. Kesha, over the past 3 days, while you were in jail, we've put together a case that goes far beyond proving your innocence. We're going to expose a conspiracy involving systematic discrimination against qualified freelance translators without formal academic pedigree. Daniel clicked on a folder on the computer. Global Tech, the first company to accuse you? They have a documented history of rejecting work from Black and Latino freelancers, regardless of quality. I found internal emails where executives explicitly discuss avoiding questionable types, their term, not mine. Diplomatic solutions is even worse, Dr. Johnson added, sliding photographs across the table. They maintain 2 lists of translators, a premium list exclusively for candidates from elite universities, and an experimental list for diversity, where they place people like you and then discard the work, claiming incompetence. Kesha felt a mixture of validation and anger rising in her chest. What about the International Aid Foundation? Mrs. Chun sighed deeply. That was the most painful to discover. They rejected your Russian translation because you translated some idiomatic expressions literally that an academic translator would have culturally adapted. But your translation was technically perfect. It preserved the original meaning that the Russian refugees really wanted to communicate. The problem, Daniel continued, is that they preferred the academically polished version from a Harvard translator who cost 3 times as much and who turned a desperate plea from refugees into bureaucratic language. Result: the proposal was rejected by the UN for sounding artificial and disconnected. Dr. Rodriguez, who had remained silent, finally spoke up. Kesha, they didn't just lie about the quality of your work. They created an impossible standard where your cultural accuracy was turned into incompetence. Over the next hour, the group revealed to Kesha the extent of the investigation that had been conducted on her behalf. Daniel had legally hacked, through public information requests and leaks from disgruntled employees, emails that showed coordination between the 3 companies to neutralize the threat of non-accredited translators who offered superior services at competitive prices. Mrs. Chun had contacted international organizations where Kesha had worked anonymously, collecting letters of recommendation and performance evaluations that completely contradicted the accusations. Dr. Johnson had identified a pattern. The 3 companies were part of an informal consortium that controlled government translation contracts, and Kesha had begun to win clients who traditionally used only their services. But most importantly, Mrs. Chen said, handing Kesha a thick envelope, "You are not alone. We found 12 other freelance translators, Black, Latino, Asian, who have suffered the same kind of sabotage over the past 5 years." Kesha opened the envelope and found handwritten letters, each telling a familiar story. Exceptional talent rejected, quality work questioned without basis, contracts cancelled after discovery of lack of formal academic credentials. "You did all this in 3 days?" Kesha asked, incredulous. "No," Daniel smiled. "Mrs. Chun has been investigating this for 2 years, ever since she learned that one of her former students had been blacklisted by a translation agency. Your case was just the catalyst to finally take action." When they returned to court, something had fundamentally changed in the atmosphere of the room. The gallery was even more crowded, but now included civil rights journalists, representatives of international organizations, and several faces Kesha recognized as freelance translators from the community. Judge Foster resumed the session with visible irritation. He had clearly used the break to research Dr. Morrison and discover that he was an internationally respected figure, not someone who could be easily dismissed. "Dr. Morrison," Foster said in a forced tone of respect, "I understand that you have evidence related to the defendant's competence. However, that does not invalidate the specific allegations made by the aggrieved companies." Morrison rose calmly. "Your Honor, with all due respect, I believe the evidence I will present not only invalidates those specific allegations, but reveals a pattern of systematic discrimination that transforms this case from one of individual fraud to one of civil rights." Prosecutor Thompson jumped out of his chair. "Objection. That is completely outside the scope." "Overruled," Foster interrupted him, clearly curious despite himself. "Dr. Morrison, proceed." It was then that Kesha realized the true genius of the plan that had been put together. They weren't just defending her innocence. They were turning her trial into a stage to expose an entire industry built on privilege and exclusion. Morrison activated a projector, and the first image appeared on the wall, a spreadsheet showing translation job rejection rates by professional demographics. "Your Honor, during my diplomatic career, I have worked with hundreds of translators. What we have found is that translators without formal university credentials, specifically those from minority communities, have rejection rates 340% higher than their colleagues with degrees, even when the quality of their work is objectively superior." The second image showed internal emails from Global Tech. These emails, obtained legally through whistleblowers, show explicit discussions about how to filter out undesirable elements from the pool of freelance translators. Thompson was pale, desperately leafing through his documents as if looking for a way out that did not exist. The third image was devastating, an audio recording of a Diplomatic Solutions executive meeting. In this recording, Morrison continued relentlessly, executives discuss how to use subjective quality standards to reject work from translators who don't fit the company profile. Kesha watched Foster, whose face had completely lost its initial arrogance. He wasn't just a judge witnessing a case of fraud, he was witnessing the live exposure of systematic discrimination that could result in federal investigations and multi-million-dollar lawsuits. And then Mrs. Chun stood up in the gallery. "Your Honor, I request permission to speak as an unregistered witness." Professor Chun, Foster hesitated, clearly at a loss as to how to proceed in a case that had turned into something much bigger than he had anticipated. 15 years ago, I taught Mandarin to a 14-year-old girl at a community library. She learned in 6 months what college students take 2 years to master. Today, that young woman is being accused of fraud because people who never bothered to assess her actual talent have decided that her background makes her abilities impossible. The silence in the room was absolute. Mrs. Chun continued, her voice carrying decades of educational authority. If this court truly seeks justice, it must ask not whether Kesha Williams defrauded her qualifications, but why an entire system conspired to invalidate talents that threatened its monopolies based on privilege, not competence. Foster looked around the room, cameras recording every word, journalists frantically taking notes, faces in the gallery watching him expectantly, and realized he had become the center of something much bigger than a simple fraud case. He had become the judge who would decide whether real talent mattered more than fabricated credentials, whether justice was blind to skin color, and whether the American judicial system was ready to confront its own hypocrisies. Under the weight of all those expectant gazes, Foster nervously adjusted his robe. What he didn't realize was that every word of contempt he had uttered earlier was being compiled into a dossier that would turn this case into the most devastating exposure of judicial bias that the American media had documented in decades, because some secrets are too powerful to remain buried, and the truth, when it finally finds its voice, it echoes in ways his oppressors could never anticipate. Foster took a deep breath, realizing he had completely lost control of the courtroom. The cameras captured every nuance of his discomfort, and he knew his prejudiced words were already going viral on social media. "Very well," he said tensely. "If you insist on this demonstration, proceed." Kesha stood in the center of the room, her handcuffs finally removed. For a moment, she simply breathed, like an athlete preparing for the performance of her life. "Your Honor, before I begin, I would like to clarify something about the companies that are accusing me." Daniel Park stood up in the gallery, activating a portable projector. The first image appeared on the wall, a WhatsApp conversation between global tech executives. "This conversation was obtained legally," Kesha announced. "Look at the date, 2 weeks after they delivered my translation, which was approved by our Chinese partners. Read what they discuss." Foster adjusted his glasses, reading aloud, "She delivered perfect work, but we can't pay freelancers without a degree. She made up an excuse and we cancelled." A shocked murmur rippled through the room. Thompson jumped out of his chair. "These messages could be fake." Kesha smiled. "Mr. Prosecutor, do you speak Mandarin?" "That's irrelevant." "It's not." Kesha turned to Mrs. Chun. "Professor, could you read aloud the Chinese partner's opinion of my translation?" Mrs. Chun stood up, picked up a document, and began reading in fluent Mandarin. Her voice echoed through the room with absolute academic authority. "Now I will translate," Kesha said calmly. The Chinese partners wrote, "This is the most culturally sensitive and technically accurate translation we have received in 5 years. The translator understands not only the words, but the intentions behind them. We highly recommend her services." Foster was pale. "How can we verify that this translation is correct?" "Because," a new voice echoed from the doorway, "I wrote that review myself." Everyone turned to see an elegant Asian man entering the courtroom. Dr. Li Wei, Director of International Relations at the Beijing Trade Corporation. "I came from the United States as soon as I heard what was happening with Miss Williams." Dr. Li walked to the front of the room. "I have worked with Miss Williams on 3 projects. Her proficiency not only in Mandarin, but in specific dialects from different regions of China, is extraordinary." Thompson tried one last desperate gambit. "Even if the Mandarin translation was adequate, there are still the problems with Arabic and Russian." "You mean this problem?" Daniel Park activated an audio recording. The voice of the CEO of the International Aid Foundation echoed through the room. Her translation was technically perfect, preserving the emotional urgency of the refugees. But we hired a Harvard professor who politely adapted the text, making it more diplomatic. Result: the UN rejected it for sounding artificial. Foster watched in horror as his courtroom became the epicenter of an exhibition of systematic discrimination broadcast live to millions. Kesha finally spoke, switching fluidly between 9 languages. She recited poetry in Arabic, discussed philosophy in German, sang a French song, explained medical concepts in Russian, each transition as natural as breathing. When she finished, the silence was absolute. Even the journalists had stopped typing. Dr. Lee broke the silence. In my 20 years of evaluating linguistic competence, I have never witnessed such natural and profound mastery. Foster was visibly shaking. His phone was buzzing incessantly, messages from superiors, the Judicial Ethics Department, civil rights organizations. Your Honor, Kesha said softly, for 3 days I thought about how to get revenge on those who tried to destroy my reputation based solely on prejudice. But I realized something: the best revenge is not to cause the same damage they caused me. She paused, watching Foster and Thompson squirm in their chairs. The best revenge is to expose the truth so clearly, so irrefutably, that the whole world can see exactly who you are. At that moment, Foster's advisor whispered in his ear. His face lost all remaining color. Miss Williams, he said in a broken voice, all charges against you are dropped. This court, he swallowed hard, offers a formal apology for the inappropriate treatment. Thompson was frantically typing on his phone, probably trying to save his career. But the live public humiliation was only the beginning, because while Foster and Thompson writhed under the weight of their own exposed ignorance, they didn't know that Kesha had saved one last revelation that would turn this personal victory into a national revolution against systematic discrimination that would change the American justice system forever. 6 months later, Kesha Williams was sitting in her new office at the United Nations, coordinating translations for global humanitarian missions. Her salary was 3 times higher than any American company had offered. Judge Foster was forced into early retirement after a federal investigation into systematic bias. Thompson lost his license to practice law when it was discovered that he had fabricated evidence in other cases involving minorities. The 3 companies that had accused her paid millions in damages and had to implement mandatory diversity programs. Several other victims of discrimination came forward, creating a wave of lawsuits that transformed corporate practices across the country. Mrs. Chun now runs the Kesha Williams Institute for Unconventional Talent, offering opportunities to bright young people without formal credentials. The best revenge, Kesha said in an international interview, is not to destroy those who underestimated you, it's to build something so extraordinary that they spend the rest of their lives wondering how they could have been so blind. Foster tried to destroy a young woman based on prejudice, but ended up exposing an entire system of discrimination. Kesha learned that true power lies not in framed papers, but in turning others' doubts into fuel for unimaginable achievements. If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel for more stories of people who turned injustice into triumph.